Find the derivative of g of x equals x cubed plus 8 divided by x squared minus 5x minus 2. Then evaluate g prime of negative 1. G of x here is the quotient of two different expressions, x cubed plus 8 divided by or over x squared minus 5x minus 2. Since the denominator has more than one term added or subtracted with the others, we cannot take the quotient directly, and therefore for the derivative we will use the quotient rule. G prime of x will be the quotient rule, derivative of the numerator, derivative of x cubed, bring the 3 down, 3x, subtract 1 from the power, 3x squared. The derivative of 8 with no x's is a 0, so derivative of the numerator times the denominator left alone minus the numerator left alone, x cubed plus 8 left alone, times the derivative of the denominator. First term will be a power rule, bring down the 2, subtract 1 from it, 2x. The second term is a constant times x, the derivative will be the constant, and then the third term is a constant with no x, the derivative of that will be a 0, so 2x minus 5. And then all of this divided by the denominator quantity squared, x squared minus 5x minus 2, all of that squared. So there's our derivative so far. We can simplify this by doing a little more work in the numerator. The first thing we're going to do is distribute the 3x squared into each of those three terms. One term times three terms will give us three terms. G prime of x will equal 3x squared times x squared will be 3x to the add the exponents. 2 plus 2 is 4. 3x squared times a negative 5x will be a negative 15. X to the add the exponents, 2 plus 1, x to the 3. 3x squared times a negative 2 will be a negative 6, x squared. And then we have minus, and this minus is going to cause every term that comes out of the next expressions to be a opposite sign or a negative. So we're going to have that negative distributing in. That means we have to write parentheses right now for the result. Now the two expressions up there have to be multiplied, and each of them have two terms, so we're going to need to FOIL that out. First, x cubed times 2x will be 2x to the 3 plus 1, 2x to the 4th. Outside, x cubed times a negative 5 will be a negative 5x cubed. Inside, 8 times a 2x will be a positive 16x. And then last, 8 times a negative 5 will be a negative 40. All of this will be divided by that same denominator. X squared minus 5x minus 2 quantity squared. Now we will distribute the negative sign in the numerator. 3x to the 4th minus 15x cubed minus 6x squared, and then minus a 2x to the 4th positive plus 5x cubed minus a negative 16x, and then a double minus, so a plus 40. All this over the denominator. Let's combine like terms together in the numerator. So g prime of x will be, I see two terms with x to the 4th. We have a 3x to the 4th and a negative 2x to the 4th. 3 minus 2 is 1. So I will end up with 1x to the 4th. I see two terms with x to the 3rd, or x cubed, a negative 15 and a positive 5. Negative 15 plus 5 is negative 10, x cubed. There's only one term with x squared, negative 6x squared. Only one term with x, negative 16x. And then only one constant, a plus 40. Over x squared minus 5x minus 2 quantity squared. So there's our derivative. That's as much as we can simplify it. The next thing to do is to evaluate g prime of negative 1. g prime of negative 1 means to plug a negative 1 in for each of the x's, so we'll have negative 1 to the 4th minus 10 times negative 1 cubed minus 6 times negative 1 squared minus 16 times negative 1 plus 40 all over negative 1 squared minus 5 times the negative 1 and then minus 2 quantity squared. Negative 1 to the 4th. Negative 1 times negative 1 is positive 1 times the negative 1 is negative 1 times 1 more negative 1 is positive 1. So that's a positive 1. We'll have minus 10 times negative 1 cubed. Negative 1 times negative 1 is positive 1. 1 more negative 1 gives us negative 1. Minus 6 times negative 1 squared, which is a positive 1. Minus 16 times the negative 1, that's a positive 16. And then plus the 40. All of this divided by a negative 1 squared, which is a 1, a negative 5 times a negative 1, which is a positive 5, and then minus a 2, all of that squared. So this is going to give us 1. A negative 1 times a negative 10 will be a positive 10. 1 plus 10. 1 times a negative 6 will give us a negative 6. We have a 16 plus a 40, that'll be a 56. All over 1 plus 5, which is 6, minus 2, which is a 4 squared. So we have 1 plus 10, which is an 11, a negative 6 plus a 56, which is a 50, over 4 squared, which is a 16. 11 plus 50 is 61 over 16. There's no common divisors for either of those two numbers, and therefore we'll leave it as 61 over 16.